Okay, so today we're going to take a look at project management number 11, which is about managing project teams. Now, there are some stark differences between managing a project team and actually managing day-to-day activities. So today we're going to look at some of the key characteristics of what a high-performance project team looks like, look at the different stages, how that impacts the factors. Then we're going to look at some other strategies while we also distinguish the functional conflict from dysfunctional conflict. Then we're going to take a look at the pitfalls before we move on to the other material that we have in the thing. Now you'll notice that through these I've already put the star on each one of them for you so that I can save it and then put it together into your study guide for your quiz that's coming up on Sunday of next week. Okay, so let's talk about this concept of synergy. And synergy is just the idea that the sum is greater than the parts. The sum is greater than the parts, right? So if you're building a house, for example, and you have 8-foot 2x4s, you can carry those around and you can do that, but then having a helper on the other end actually makes it much, much easier and much faster. So the two of you working together means that you end up with much greater energy from the whole thing. So synergy is a portmanteau of synchronous energy, synergy, right? And the idea is that you're better together than you are by yourself. And so some of the characteristics of a high-performing team is this shared sense of purpose, right? We're all in this together. We're moving forward together. And then we also understand how each of the individual talents and expertise fit together in the thing. And so we have balanced and shared roles that help problem solving come much, much faster. We also accept the differences of opinion and we encourage risk-taking. And so we also have to set high personal performance standards as well while we're identifying with the team, all right? So pay attention to this slide. This is important so that you'll understand this, okay? Again, you know that probably the way I'm going to ask questions on this is all of the following are characteristics of a high-performing team except, or I might say identifying with the team is a characteristic of a high-performing team, all right? So with that in mind, let's take a look at what are the 5 stages of team development. They're forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Forming is when we come together. This is when we develop and we establish the ground rules, the formalities are there, right? We have, it's probably someone you already know, so on and so forth. The next phase, the storming phase, this is where we start infighting. This is where we start, well, you said you were going to do this and they didn't do that and this group, whatever. And a lot of groups rarely get through the storming phase, right? We've already had one of the groups that couldn't get past this and we had to dissolve that group, and that's okay. That happens. Sometimes that happens. If you can overcome it though, very often you come together and you do what's called norming. This is when you say, okay, this is my role, this is your role. We've learned to accept each one another's viewpoint, and then we can move to the performing phase. This is when we start to look at the flexibility and realize that the goal is more important than the individuals. Finally, when we're done, we adjourn. Adjourning is this idea that we're going to break up the team, we come back, we recognize one another's individual contributions. Every one of these phases is as important as any of the other. But I can tell you that if you don't let it hash itself out in the storming phase, the ability where people come together and they say, this is what we're doing, this is who we are as a team, then you won't move through to the other phases of the project. So what are some of the conditions that favor a high-performing project team? Well, first, there's 10 or fewer team members. Any more than that, and you start to break up into smaller splinter groups. So even now, when we have just 4 team members, a lot of times what you'll see is that you have 2 or 3 who are meeting and then one person's left out, right? They need to be voluntary team members. You know and I know that if the professor, even with a group project in class, if the professor tells you that you're going to be on a team, then that team rarely makes a contribution. But the teams, even this semester, I've seen that the teams where the membership is voluntary, they are high-performing teams. So let me give a little shout out to Cole and his team for just a moment, right? You guys have done a hell of a job with your project. Every one of you are on the team because you want to be there. There's only 4 of you on the team, right? And you've pulled that together and you've done a good job. Now, part of it also is the fact that you've committed to it, and so there's a continuous service on that team. There's also a full-time assignment, like this is our team, and you have established a culture of cooperation and trust amongst one another, okay? This one's important, but not nearly as important as the idea that all of the functional areas are represented. Let's say you're doing an IT project, right? IT needs the help of the finance department because I got to get stuff built. They need the help of the faculty because they're the ones that are working together. And so if you don't have every functional team represented, when the ideas are actually rolled out, it seems like that one group is dominating the other. First and foremost, though, you need to have a compelling objective. You need to know why you're doing what you're doing, all right? And finally, members need to be in close communication with one another. Now, I know that it's no secret that right now, communication is probably the hardest thing that you have going for your teams. It's hard to communicate even when you see one another every day. But when you have to make a commitment to communicate behind the scenes, it's even more difficult. All right. Now, this next one here is there. You're not going to be required to know this, but let me just go over it very quickly, right? The idea of what's called the punctuated equilibrium model is that you have to find a midpoint, or you have to find some sort of balance between one or more of the group members who want to move forward very quickly, and then you have some of the other group members who are just not as comfortable with it. In every group, we always have that one person who's a go-getter, who gets 75% of the work done on the first day. They are the most annoying damn people in the world, because then they turn around and expect everybody else to work at the same pace, and sometimes that's just not possible, okay? On the other end of the spectrum, we have those people who wait to the last minute, and they believe if it weren't for the last minute, nothing would ever get done in this world. And so you have to find a way to strike a balance, and one of the ways you can do that is what's called the equilibrium model, all right? So in the first phase, you look and say, who's going to be the people who get stuff done, who get everything in charge, so on and so forth. So you're planning a party, right? And a party is an event, AKA it's a project. You have that one person who, with a helper, is going to get everything, and they're going to pull it all together, and they're going to put all the material in the middle of the floor. And then 2 days before the party, everybody shows up. They have a pre-party, and they throw everything together and say, hey, look, this looks great. We're having a lot of fun. Let's move forward. That's where you are in phase two. And then finally, the completion model is, where we are. And so that's the end of it, right? Now, one of the ways that you create a high-performing team is starting with recruiting the team members. So you look at project meetings and say, look, we're looking for voluntary cooperation here. We need people who want to be here. Then you establish a team identity. Finally, you create a shared vision, and you build a reward system. Like, hey, if we do this, we're going to have a lot of fun with this, right? Then you have to manage the project team, manage the conflict, and then every now and again, you're going to have to rejuvenate your project team. So yesterday, I had a conversation with one of the groups where it was clear that they were going off the rails, but they all got together. They all said, hey, let's meet up with Joe. Let's develop a project plan, and we'll move forward at a much greater pace. And I can tell you, I came away from that meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. I saw in that meeting, I saw a good, solid project manager. I saw someone who got it together. I saw someone who had rejuvenated their project team. And I'm going to now be able to say that team is going to move forward and they're going to be successful. So those of you who are working on the Ninny restaurant, I tell you, you guys are going to do a good job with this. Y'all are kicking ass with this, and I want you to move forward and be successful. All right, so good job on that. Now, how do you recruit good project members? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to understand that there are factors that are going to be affecting this recruiting. Not everybody has time for your project, and that's okay. Don't try to strong arm them into doing the project. If they can be there, fine. If not, let it go, right? So how do you do that? Ask for volunteers. Hey, man, we're doing this exciting new project, and I think if we did a good job on it, we would move forward and we could really affect change. You want people who have problem-solving ability, people who are available, have technical expertise, people who have credibility. Right now, I'm working on a project where I'm evaluating some software that's going to really be a game-changing technology for the university. All right. I need people who have credibility on my team. So the first person I asked was the Dean of Students, Mike Petrosky. He has the technical expertise. He has the credibility. He has problem-solving ability, right? He certainly has political connections, and he has familiarity. He's on my side, and so I'm going to be able to get things done. The only thing he doesn't have right now is availability. So when I go to him and I say, hey, we need to get this project done, how can you help me? I go not with problems, I go with solutions and say, which one do you think is the best solution, right? Because that maximizes his time. When I was putting together the program for data analytics and the program for cybersecurity, we went through the same thing. And the person that I got on my team there was the Chief Information Officer, Chris Bonaforte, because Chris had the political connections, he had the ambition, he had the initiative, he had the energy, he knew how to get things done. And so with that in mind, I was able to pull things together. All right. So now what do the project meetings look like? Well, the first thing we need to do is we're going to establish ground rules, right? Here's what we're going to talk about and here's what we're not going to talk about. Then we make decisions. How are we going to pull it all together? We track those decisions and we manage the change. We then look at relationship decisions. Do we need to cut people from the team or can we move forward? We establish the norms and then we say, okay, here's what we're going to wrap up with next meeting. Okay. All right. So, right, I want to stop real quick and double check to see if we have any questions, right? And it doesn't look like we do. Okay. And so for now, right, I'm just going to move forward. And if you do have any questions, right, I'll come back in about 5 minutes and we'll go over them again. All right. So what are some of the norms? Well, first is confidentiality, right? No information is shared outside the team unless all agree on it. That is of crucial importance because what will happen is you will get other people who are involved in it and they don't even, they didn't even know they had an opinion until you told them about this. And then all of a sudden they're trying to stab you in the back with it. Okay, so you don't relay it until everybody has gone through it and everybody has made a decision. Once that decision is made, then you can release it out en masse. All right, it's acceptable for you to be in trouble. Let me say that again. It is acceptable for you to be in trouble, but it is not acceptable for you to surprise others with it. As soon as you think you're not going to meet your deadlines, you need to let somebody know. Hey guys, we have a problem with this. We need to figure out what we're going to do. Then you figure it out, and then you go to your project sponsor and say, hey, this is what we've come up with. Here's the solutions. What do you think? Which one of these do you think is going to be the best? All right. Number 3 here is of utmost importance as well. There is no tolerance for you bullying your way through a problem or an issue. You understand? You just don't do that. That is not acceptable. So let me get through this slide, and I'll come and see if we have any questions here. Sometimes you have to agree to disagree, but then once a decision is made, you have to move forward, okay? Sometimes you have to agree to disagree. Colin Powell once famously said, Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was Secretary of State under George W. Bush. And he made the statement, he said, you have not only the right, but the obligation to speak your mind right up until the decision is made. Once the decision is made, you have 2 choices. You either get with the program or you find another organization. So you have the right and obligation to speak your voice until the decision is made. And once the decision is made, 2 choices, get with it or get out, right? So with that in mind, also remember that you have to respect everybody else. There's a position that you have on the team, but you don't flaunt that. Everybody else that's on the outside of the team, they need to know that you're part of the organization still. And then hard work doesn't have to get in the way of you having a lot of fun, okay? All right, so do we have any questions about that particular thing before we move on? Okay. All right, so I didn't mean to do that. So where were we here? We are here, okay? So let's take a look at how you can establish a team identity. The first thing is you are mindful of people's time. You always keep an eye on the clock, right? You use your meetings effectively so you don't waste their time. Then they respect you for that. You need to have a co-location for the team members. If you can find a sequestered area where your team is working there, then you're good to go. Also, you want to create a project team name, Team Alpha, right? Team whatever it is, Team Ninny, right? Whatever you want to say, okay? For those of you who are creating the children's book, open up your mic and tell us, what's the title of your children's book going to be?
Our title is going to be, hold on a second. It's Exploring Our Gigantic Solar System.
Okay, so you could be Team Gigantic, or you could be Team Solar System, right? Whatever you want to do, okay? Or you could be Team iBook, that's okay. If you want to come up with a code name, that's okay too, right? And then getting the team to do stuff together and having team rituals. Those are all of importance as well, okay? Okay, all right. Now, let me give you an example of how that's actually worked in the past. The team that worked on making the first computer mouse was a team called IDEO. And IDEO worked at Stanford, and they are the lead design school in the United States, okay? So they worked with Apple and Steve Jobs back in the 1980s to develop the world's first computer mouse. The computer mouse was working very well, but they were having one issue in that they were thinking outside the box too far. So they were molding these rubber balls to go inside the computer mouse. And for those of you who don't know, mice used to not be laser. They used to be a ball that would run on two tracks, and it would pick up which direction you were moving and reverse it so that it would look like it was on the ball. But anyway, long story short, the way they were making those little rubber balls that went in there was what's called injection molding. And so they would squirt the rubber into the injection mold, and then it left a line around the ball, which caused a problem. And so they couldn't fix the problem, and they couldn't develop it. And so Steve Jobs came in, and he pretty much berated them. He's like, you guys told me you could get this done, and you're nothing but a bunch of, quote, limp-dicked assholes. Well, of course, that, had a lot of negative connotation to it. But they actually took it and rallied around it. And they built a cohesive unit around that to where it was an us versus him mentality. Like, well, to hell with him, we're going to get this done. And so they all went, the team manager had some t-shirts made, and they became Team LDA. And through that, they developed a team ritual where every time they passed by a picture of Steve Jobs, they would give him the finger. And that motivated them to actually get the job done. And what they did is they found out that in baseball, they don't make that injection molded. They put a pill in, and then they run these pills through a machine to make the little rubber ball that goes inside a baseball. And so they copied that same process, and they solved the problem. All right. So now, what we need for an effective project vision is here. I'm not going to go through vision statements and all that because you have an entire class on that. But what we do need, the biggest and foremost, is at the top. We need a strategic sense of purpose, and we need to learn to communicate that so that we can have passion and inspire others. All right. So when you're managing your reward system, you need to make sure that you have both group rewards and individual rewards. Obviously, that you're going to have the entire group is going to say, hey, we did this together, but there's always going to be standouts on the team, right? Who's going to get that individual reward? And you need to make the reward have a lasting significance. Look, no secret. Right now, times are tough. And you can't go out and say, hey, here's an extra $100, here's $1,000 bonus or whatever. But if you give them a trophy that they can display and say, hey, that $15 trophy that someone says, hey, we did a hell of a job here, that's going to have a lasting significance for them, okay? Then how do you individualize that performance? Letters of recommendation, public reconciliation, and recognition of their outstanding work, right? Giving them better assignments and maybe increase personal flexibility, right? Now, it's exactly the opposite of that in academia. The harder you work and the better teacher you are, the more students who come to you because they can't get it done anywhere else. And I'm okay with that. I think that that's actually a badge of honor, that students who are smart, sophisticated, and know how to get the job done, but maybe have something a little different that they need to overcome, they come to Joe because they know Joe's going to help them overcome that, right? It also makes me feel gracious and fills my heart with gratitude that I know every one of you, if you come to me, you know you're going to get the straight dope. You know I'm going to tell you the truth, right? I'm going to keep it 100. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that you trust me to do that. Okay. So, all right. So how do we do this, right? How do we look at our decision-making process? There's 4 steps, right? First, you identify the problem. Then you generate alternatives, you reach a decision, and you follow up. Now, there's actually 5 steps in the design process. We'll talk about that in subsequent classes, all right? First thing is you identify the problem. You identify the problem. Believe me when I tell you that is by far the hardest piece of the puzzle. Identifying the problem is the single hardest piece of the entire puzzle, all right? Now, once you've done that, okay, once you've identified the problem, you also have to come and start thinking about how can you manage the conflict, right? So there's both functional and dysfunctional conflict. Functional conflict is that conflict that moves you toward a resolution, moves you toward where you need to be. You want to encourage that functional conflict, right? So how do you do that? You ask the tough questions. You bring in people with a different point of view, and someone plays devil's advocate so they can say, yeah, but what if? Okay. You ask the team members to consider unthinkable alternatives. What would happen if we had unlimited resources? What would this look like if we could move it forward? And you manage the dysfunctional conflict through mediation, arbitration, control. And finally, sometimes you just have to accept it. And if the person who's just will not work well with others, sometimes you have to eliminate it. And that's absolutely the last source, of course, but sometimes that's what you have to do. And you've all worked with people who are just straight up assholes. I know you have. I've worked with them. You've worked with them. You know, sometimes you have to do that. All right. Now, let's talk about some of those other things that you want to do. I want to tell you the story, right? When I was a young project manager, and I was probably 21 at the time, I had this idea that I couldn't have conflict on my team, that everybody had to get along. And that was just absolutely the wrong thing to do. And so I was pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, like, let's all get along, right? And one day, the best person on my team, this old guy who'd been working in construction for 30 years, he came to me and says, look, man, he's like, I just want you to know this job is not for me. He said, nothing personal, but you just don't know what the hell you're doing. I'm like, I was flabbergasted because I thought I was doing a good job. And I'm like, okay, I get it. It's your decision. But before you leave, will you tell me what I did wrong? He said, yeah, you're always trying to put out the fire. He said, man, sometimes you need to let that fire go because it builds a fire in their belly, right? And I learned from that lesson. I learned that sometimes you have to be the person that lets that conflict go, right? And so, of course, you have to manage dysfunctional conflict when it's just petty griping and arguing. You want that out of your life. But if it's productive, let it go, right? So we're going to skip this, right? Just tell you that there are areas there. You can take a look at that on your own, but that's not really that important. Here is what's important, right? So there are some, when you're moving through the project, and every one of you are in this phase right now when you're like, God, man, I'm just so tired of this. I have so many projects to do, and there's so much shit to do. And how do we, my God, how are we going to do this, right? Well, there's some informal and formal techniques. So the informal stuff is like, let's just start something else. Take an offsite break or do something. Just like, you know what, let's just go watch. Like sometimes it's, let's just sit down and have a heart to heart and you hash it out and you tell me what I'm doing wrong and I'll tell you what you're doing wrong, right? Then there's some formal techniques where you have like a team building session or you look at other things, right? These, believe it or not, in my opinion, are less likely to rebuild the team than the actual informal. Okay. When you go to somebody and say, you know what, this just sucks. Let's just take a break and we'll come back on Monday and figure it out. That's much, much better than the whole formal techniques. The formal techniques generally tend to be canned and not nearly as effective, right? Okay. All right, so let's talk about where we are right now, okay? Every single one of you have faced this. So let's go through this, and then I'm going to stop, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how we can actually fix this, right? So, challenges of developing a virtual team. First one right off the bat, trust. You have to exchange information with one another, right? You have to develop your team in such a way that makes that hard. And one of the first challenges is I'm not sure if I want to give certain people my contact information. It's one thing to see them at school. It's one thing to see them at the office. It's an entirely different thing when I turn on that camera and you see the crap that's in my background, right? Now, you've all seen some of the other things, right? Where, have you seen the video where the guy thought he was off camera and he gets up, he's not wearing pants, and he just starts scratching his butt, right? I'm sure y'all have seen that video. Okay, if you haven't, I'll put you a link. Okay, one of the best ones you can find right now is Zoom fails on YouTube. Hilarious shit. Okay, how do you do that? Well, first thing is you can't let people vanish, right? You can't let them vanish. If you see that there are 3 or 4 or 5 times that they're not getting things done, then maybe what you need to do is step in and say, hey, we need to have an emergency meeting. Establish a code of conduct. We're going to be here every day at a certain time. The norms, the protocols, okay? Using electronic technology like we're doing right now, and then sharing the pain, man. Like, look, you know, this shit sucks. I get it. I understand, right? And so what we see right now is that we have a lot of teams who are on different schedules, and every one of them is in a different place. One of the things you can do is establish or share your calendar with folks, okay? And as a result of that, then you can pull everything together, say, hey, this works for me and this doesn't work for me, okay? All right, so let's talk about 4 other things, and I'm going to stop and open up the room to everybody else. So let's talk about what each one of these are, okay? Groupthink. Groupthink is this idea that you can't have a dissenting opinion, and you start to everybody think the same way. Well, you know, Joe said it. He's the authority, so it must be true. I'm not going to challenge that. Maybe I'm wrong, okay? Well, maybe Joe's wrong, and maybe you need to tell him in a polite, professional way, look, dude, I don't think that's right, okay? This next one is what's called bureaucratic bypass syndrome. This is when you're like, you know what, I just need to start getting it done. I'm not going to follow the rules. I am very susceptible to that because I'm just a grab the bull by the horns and get shit done kind of guy. And when the rules get in my way, I generally tend to run over the rules, and that gets me in trouble. So don't be like Joe when it comes to that. You still have to follow the rules, okay? Sometimes team spirit can become team infatuation. You're working at a certain level, you're getting shit done, and you're like, you know what? We got this, and I don't need the rest of this organization. Then you have crossed the line. You're part of a bigger team, and you need to think about that. Going native is when you're at, like, in a different area, you're in a different part of the world, and you start to think like the locals, and you start to think like everybody else, and you don't want to come back from that. You don't want to be a part of anything other than your project team. So I had an uncle back in the 1970s. He worked for Exxon, right? And Exxon had gone down to Venezuela to help them build up their infrastructure. Now, this is before they became a socialist country. They were still capitalist. So he was working down there and he was doing his thing, and his name was Bob. So Uncle Bob is down there and he's working, and he'd come home about once a month and he'd visit his family in Texas. Unbeknownst to them, Uncle Bob had gone native, literally had gone native. He had met a woman in Venezuela, and he had married that woman in Venezuela, even though he was married to my Aunt Rachel in Texas. He had 2 kids by the woman in Venezuela, so he basically had a family in Venezuela and a family in Texas. And then in the early 1980s, when they started to, when they had finished up the project, He basically came home to Aunt Rachel and said, look, you know, these kids are grown. I'm leaving. I'm going back to Venezuela. And nobody ever heard of Uncle Bob again. So clearly, Uncle Bob had gone native, right? So, all right. So let's stop here. Let's talk about some key terms, what you need to think about. The nominal group technique, you don't need to know about that, but the rest of the stuff, that's important. So make sure that you know what each one of those are. And they're either highlighted there. If not, let me know and I'll give you a good definition for them. Okay. So with that in mind, okay,